does the government want to set a minimum proportion of where to borrow from a capital market that is yet to develop? To the judges for further analysis. It is therefore for this reason that I oppose to the motion which states, and I articulate, this House would require a minimum proportion of government borrowing to be sourced from the domestic capital market. And of course, now as the Prime Minister, my duty is simple to task to make sure that as the August House we understand what the motion is trying to communicate. I'll first start by defining the key terminologies contained within the motion. And the first key term is government borrowing. According to the Ministry of Finance, this is the process by which government raises funds to finance its budget and meet other public financing requirements. The other key term is domestic capital market. This is a domestic capital. This is a capital market within Zambia through which long-term funds are raised and invested using their financial instruments such as government bonds, corporate bonds, and shares. And last but not the least, the other key term is minimum proportion. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a compulsory percentage below which the government borrows from the domestic capital market to the judges for further analysis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my obligation to give you a stance of what we're trying to communicate as the opposition. Now, we are not saying that the government should not borrow, but what we are saying is that they should not set a minimum proportion, because this is going to injure the capital markets of Zambia. Because why? They haven't developed yet. Interjection sustained.
Members of this August House, an interjection to would you rather expose the economy to the foreign exchange crisis than to avoid pay a minimum amount?
Ladies and gentlemen, what we are trying to say as the opposition is that even if it will require us to borrow from foreign investors for us to make a stable capital market, then let us do so. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to proceed. If we are going to make a minimum proportion as the government, it is going to injure the private sector. Allow me to quote from the parliamentary report which stated, and I articulate, if the government leans heavily on government borrowing in the domestic securities, it has the potential to crowd out the private sector. This is why we are saying that the government should not set a minimum proportion to borrow, because it is going to injure the private sector. Interjection not allowed. Let me proceed, ladies and gentlemen. According to the Capital Markets Plus, sustained.
Assembled House of Intellectuals, can the opposition provide evidence that minimum proportion of domestic borrowing necessarily crowds out private investment rather than stimulating Zambia's capital market?
Ladies and gentlemen, to the evidence that are provided to the judges, it clearly stated, and I quote, if the government continues to borrow from the private sector, it is going to injure them. That is the evidence from submitting. Allow me to proceed. Ladies and gentlemen, a compulsory minimum proportion is going to remove flexibility. What are we trying to say as the government? For example, if the government sets a minimum proportion of 40%, what if a businesswoman in Shangombo cannot afford? What if a businessman in Chipata cannot afford? Is that going to be flexibility at all? No. What we are saying is that the government should borrow, but they should maintain. They should not set a minimum proportion, because that is going to lead to rigidity. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my obligation to give a roadmap on how we are going to move as the opposition. Our second speaker is going to come give you reasons as to why we are saying if we set a minimum proportion, it is going to crowd the private sector. And our third speaker is going to come and give you reasons as to why we are saying that we shouldn't set a minimum proportion, because Zambia's capital markets are not stable yet. And our summarizer is going to come rebut some of the misconceptions that are going to be raised by the opposition, as well as cement on our points as the opposition. Ladies and gentlemen, with laying a foundation like this one, I hereby rest my case.
This is what debate is, ladies and gentlemen, the second quarterfinal between Evelyn Horn College and the National Institute of Public Administration. We proceed with the debate, and at this point we call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to give his submission.
Confidence, courage, zeal, and enthusiasm is what a debater carries with him before standing in front of an audience. But only an intellectual as that one coming from the National Institute of Public Administration carries with him the brains as that of Einstein, the ruthless as that of Hitler, and the fearless as that of Nelson Mandela. Members of the auditorium, standing before you all, my name is Pochilufya Mwape, that boy from Mumbwa trying to make a difference. Members of the auditorium, it would be unwise for a wise leader as I to continue without having to acknowledge the presence of the following people. The panel of the adjudicators, I salute you, and to the ever-smiling audience, allow me to simply say, protocol be highly and highly observed. Members of the auditorium, the motion under microscopic scrutiny stipulates, as I articulate, this House would require a minimum proportion of government borrowing to be sourced from domestic capital markets. Members of the auditorium, allow me to proceed to my first point, which is it eliminates exchange rate risk. Members of the auditorium, in the year 2020, a dark cloud had fallen upon the Zambian economy. This was during the COVID-19 pandemic. Members of the auditorium, this led to Zambia's economy, this led to the Zambian kwacha depreciating. And members of the auditorium, this led to Zambia defaulting to pay back over 3 billion in euro bonds. Allow me to quote from an article which was published on the 6th of December 2023, which was titled The Road to Zambia's 2020 Default. Members of the auditorium, it states as I articulate, on the 13th of November 2020, Zambia became the first African country to default on its Eurobond debt during the COVID-19 pandemic. May this be passed to the judges for further verification. Members of the auditorium, I'm going to ask the opposition, I'm going to give them two options, members of the auditorium. If you were to be asked to say, if you were to borrow 20 kwacha, you are to pay back 20 kwacha. Or if you are to borrow 20 kwacha and you are supposed to pay back 1,000, which one would you choose, members of the auditorium? Members of the auditorium, we are definitely going to choose borrowing a 20 kwacha and paying back a 20 kwacha. And this can only be achieved if we choose to be borrowing from domestic capital markets. Allowed.
Thank you. Now it's so depressing to see an honorable speaker trying to mislead the House. When you say we're trying to choose between borrowing a 20 kwacha versus a huge amount, do you understand that we have treasury bonds as well as government bonds, where even if you invest 100 kwacha, you cannot get back 100 kwacha. The same government will give you more returns because your money is going to mature. Whether they borrow locally or they borrow internationally, they are going to pay back with interest. Members of the House of Debate, the government has been borrowing locally and they've continued borrowing internationally. Thank you.
Members of the auditorium, as the mighty government, we know to say the duty to develop our country lies with us. Members of the auditorium, it is so heartbreaking and disheartening to see the opposition telling us to say if you borrow a certain amount, it will definitely mature. Members of the auditorium, even if it matures, that money will be circulated within our country. Doesn't that show development? Members of the auditorium, allow me to proceed to my next point. My next point, members of the auditorium, is that it reduces capital flight. For days and years, members of the auditorium, we've continued to sing a same song. And this song has been, Zambia is a developing country. Zambia is a third world country. Members of the auditorium, as the mighty government, I want to urge each and every one of you in this August House to say the sole duty to develop our country lies with us. And capital flight has been one of the major contributing factors, members of the auditorium, that has led a country like Zambia to be stuck to the third world developing countries. Members of the auditorium, as the mighty government, I heard their speakers come to this August House and tell us to say these people do not have the capacity. But members of the auditorium, I want you to understand one thing. If the capital is low for this capital market and we borrow the small capital that they have and we repay them back, increasing the interest, doesn't that mean that we are growing and empowering these capital markets? Members of the auditorium, as the mighty government, we understand and believe. Allowed?
Affiliates of this session, this government is indeed trying to ride on emotions. Affiliates of this session, as the current state of the budget plan, the government is owing domestic arrears of about 80.2 billion. What do you mean you're paying back?
Members of the auditorium, I'm going to remind them again. These debts that we owe these domestic, most definitely we are going to pay them back. We are a government that believes in ourselves, a government that is confident. And when we pay back that 80 billion that they are telling us, members of the auditorium, that money will be used to develop our country, which means that as a third world country, we are moving to being a developed country. Members of the auditorium, as the mighty government,
Time is up, honorable member.
20 seconds to summarize.
20 seconds.
Members of the auditorium, allow me to quote from a article which was posted in the ZNBC Today page, which say government releases 49.1 billion for June program. Now, this be passed to the judges for verification. Members of the auditorium, I want to tell each and everyone in this house to say, as the mighty, you've seen we have given over 49 billion to ensure to say these very local capital markets develop. With this few but convincing point, I rest my case.
If NIPA makes it to the next round, please let's get them a bigger. I think the member of the house needed more space to make his submission. A round of applause for the Deputy Prime Minister. Those of you joining us on Facebook, you can follow us on the Securities and Exchange Commission page. You can also follow the debate on the Capital Markets Association of Zambia page. We proceed with the debate. It's the second quarterfinal between NIPA and Evelyn Horn College, and at this point the opposition will come in with the deputy opposition leader.
Thank you for the call. Thank you for the call. Assembled intellects, we the opposition are not here today to make claims, but we are here to state facts and facts only. Assembled intellects, allow me now to make mention and quote from the Capital Markets Master Plan of 2022, the vision and the mission of the capital markets, and I quote, start of quotation. The capital markets vision is to reposition the Zambian capital markets to become an attractive international destination for long-term investment and be the primary choice for accessing long-term investment capital for Zambia that will enable sustainable development as well as growth and stability of the country. Good Samaritan, please do likewise. Assemble the intellects. Taken.
It's not yet a minute. Please hold your fire.
Assembled intellects, it is at this juncture that I would love now to make my salutations to the panel of adjudicators. The moderator, or need I say, or diplomatic etiquette is highly and duly observed. Today we are gathered to scrutinize the motion and the fundamental analysis which states, and I quote, start of quotation, this house would require the minimum proportion of government borrowing to be sourced from domestic capital markets, end of quotation. Assembled intellects, what we the opposition are suggesting today is that the Zambian government should not borrow from the domestic capital market. But what we are trying to communicate today is that, yes, borrowing should be there, but what we are against is that a minimum proportion should not be set. Ladies and gentlemen, now the House and the wise taken.
Members of the auditorium, the opposition seems to be misleading the House. The Speaker read to say the aim of these capital markets is to be a long-term investment. Now, members of the auditorium, if they are telling us to say we shouldn't be borrowing from them, how then are the capital markets going to achieve their goal of being long-term investments?
Thank you for that interjection. Assembled intellects, now, in order for us to enhance and widen as well as deepen the capital markets, we, the opposition, are calling for flexibility and rather not rigidity. Assembled intellects, allow me now to forge ahead by making mention of how, when we set a minimum proportion of government borrowing to be sourced from domestic capital markets, it does not only injure the Zambian domestic capital markets, but, ladies and gentlemen, it also injures the government itself and ordinary citizens like you and I. Now, assembled intellects, it is at this juncture that I would love also to stretch out how the government is actually disadvantaged. Assembled intellects, with me here, not allowed. With me here is an extract from the APP which actually shows to say, yes, the government has been trying to consider domestic borrowing, but it also suggests to say this yet alone will put a strain on the domestic capital markets. Good Samaritan, pass this to the judges for further verification. Aside from that, ladies and gentlemen, I would also love to make mention out of how setting a minimum proportion would actually injure the capital markets. Assembled intellects, as my leader from the opposition made mention to say, the government actually owns the domestic and has actually not paid. Now, would you want to then expose the developing domestic capital markets of Zambia to a government that cannot actually pay domestic domestic areas. Good Samaritan, please pass this to the judges for
May the
further
speaker pause?
verification.
Members of the auditorium, the speaker is telling us to say it is going to injure each and every citizen. Now, members of the auditorium, I want to ask the speaker to clarify on how borrowing from a local market and paying back to a local market is going to injure us.
Assembled intellects, to respond to that, allow me to make a quotation from the report of the Planning and Budgeting Committee. Start of quotation. Assembled intellects, these actually recognize to say borrowing. The committee observes with the concern that continued heavy involvement of the government in the domestic security market has a potential of crowding out the private sector as well as individuals. Good Samaritan, please do as wise. Assembled intellects, these are not claims but rather they are facts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to also cement on how borrowing a fixed minimum proportion from domestic capital markets will actually sideline individuals as well as the private sector. Assembled intellects, when government borrows heavily from domestic capital markets, they actually compete with the private sector. Now, here is the catch. Would you rather borrow or lend money to a business owner who offers to pay you 18% interest, but you know to say there are risks attached to it? Or would you rather borrow the government 16% when you know to say government bonds are risk-free? Definitely banks will actually sideline institution. 30 seconds to wind up.
20 seconds only.
Definitely assembled intellects banks would actually opt for the government. Now, this will then lead to the private sector being injured, to individuals like you and I not having capitals to sustain our businesses. Now, assembled intellects, to conclude, allow me to say we are not advocating for rigidity but rather flexibility. With this being said, I now declare this motion has fallen.
A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. The reigning champions in a bid to defend their title as provincial champions of Lusaka. But obviously NIPA has something to say about that, and at this point we'll give an opportunity to the member of government.
Every time when the Zambian kwacha falls, foreign aid members of the symposium increases. What then will stop us from using our own currency to protect ourselves from such crisis? Members of this symposium proposing to the motion which states and articulate this house will require a minimum proportion of government borrowing This house would require a minimum proportion of government borrowing to be sourced from domestic markets. End of quote. Members of the symposium, the reason why we, the mighty government, are saying that we should borrow from our local markets is because we want to cut out the exchange rates risk. Members of this symposium, to show that I'm a speaker who doesn't speak from within the bounds of debate, allow me to quote from an article which was published by the Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation, which states to say, according to the Ministry of Finance Debt Statistical Bulletin for the fourth quarter of 2025, domestic borrowing remains a key pillar of the government's financing strategy. May the good Samaritan do as wise. Members of this symposium, the reason why we as the government are saying that we want to use our domestic market as one of the sources of borrowing is because we want to create a balance. We are suggesting that let's use a beam balance. Let's use both the foreign aid as well as our domestic allowed.
Affiliates of this station, this government seems to be talking about a balance that they are not ready to back up. They are asking for a minimum proportion which can be set at 40% or 50%. How is there a balance compared to the domestic investors that also rely on capital investments? Please clarify.
Thank you for that interjection. Members of the symposium, from the article which was also published by the Zambian National Broadcasting Corporation, it clearly highlights to say over 253 billion kwacha was sourced from the same domestic market, which the opposition are claiming that they don't have the financial muscle and the capacity to. Members of this symposium, may the good Samaritan do as wise. Members of this symposium, we are not saying that the local markets are not only, but what we are trying to do is we want to create a balance. We want to have a Allowed.
Thank you. I think the speakers from the government are missing the point, panel of educators. We recognize the imperative role that this capital market have on our country, and we agree that yes, borrowing must continue. It should never stop in life. What we expect you when you come on that podium, give us the percentage you are proposing. Don't tell us strike a balance. What balance are you trying to strike?
Members of
Borrowing
this
should
symposium,
continue.
members of this symposium, thank you for that interjection. When we say that the minimum amount, we are talking about a 20% minimum account. We are talking about a 30% minimum. And the opposition was misleading this house to say that we're going to have a fixed. Members of this symposium, we need to take into consideration that the economy performs, and according to the dispensation of time, that's how the rates are going to be accorded for the domestic markets. Members of this symposium, we are a government that is responsible for the development of the question. And if indeed they're still arguing with the government, the question, if we continue to procrastinate, the question is, when are we going to take the right step to take the nation of Zambia forward? Members of this symposium, we as a leadership have the key mandate and the responsibility to take the nation forward. We cannot continue procrastinating and keep claiming to say we're a developing nation, whilst we still have a chance to make this nation develop. With these few but convincing points, I rest my case.
This is quite a heated quarterfinal. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for the member of government. Let's give an opportunity to the member of the opposition to say something.
Members of the House, a claim and a fact are two different things. Affiliates of this session, when you're given a responsibility to carry public interest on your back, you should remember that charity begins at home. But the current government seems to forget that fact. Mr. Moderator, your call is acknowledged. It would be unwise of me to go ahead and forge without recognizing or diplomatic etiquette in this house. May I simply say all protocols are highly and duly observed. Affiliates of this session, we as the opposition party are here to actually propose solutions to the government with numbers, because numbers don't lie. Affiliates of this session, allow me to quote from the annual budget plan that states that in 2026 annual budget plan outlined a gross domestic borrowing target of 106 kwacha billion. Affiliates of this session, this is proof that this government has been borrowing from domestic investors. Good Samaritans, do as wise. But our stance is, do not come back and set a minimum proportion from the very domestic investors that you've already been borrowing from. Affiliates of this session, our other stance to the government is to advise them that you cannot keep going back to the very domestic investments that you're trying to develop, or rather claim to want to develop, and borrow more from them. Allowed.
Members of the auditorium, the opposition seem not to be understanding the motion. The motion is telling us to say this house would require a minimum proportion of government borrowing to be sourced from domestic capital market. This is telling us that the government should be borrowing from you. Your earlier speaker told us to say borrowing must continue, but you are here and you are telling us to say, how can we be borrowing from these same capital markets? What is it that you are trying to tell this August House?
Thank you for the question. Affiliates of this station, what we're trying to tell this August House is that this government is trying to set precedence on domestic capital markets, which is going to injure the very development we're trying to achieve. What we said in the earlier alluded evidence is 106 billion kwacha has already been borrowed. How minimum do you want it to go? Affiliates of this session, we earlier stated that the current budget shows that the government is owing domestic arrears of about 80.2 billion kwacha, which they claim they will pay back. And yet they come back to ask you for more. Are you sure you would trust such a government? Allowed.
members of this August House, is the current speaker aware that there was a document called the Benchmark Bond Lending Plan, which was released on the 24th of March this year, which clearly highlights on how far the government is going to make the fixed payments of this year?
Affiliates of this session, highlighting how far the government will go and going ahead to at least pay a fixed percentage rate to the domestic areas are two different things, and that is the stance of the opposition. Good Samaritans, please do as wise. Affiliates of this session, the government should receive these recommendations from us, which is diversification of sources of your borrowing. One, you have a wide range exposure to different sources that you can go for. Why would you want to be so rigid to go back to the very domestic investments, capital markets that are trying to enhance the economy of Zambia? Allowed.
It's not allowed. Please continue.
Affiliates of this session, number one, governments can borrow from concession or external loans. They can borrow from domestic borrowing, which is the very capital markets. They can borrow from multilateral financing, development partners, capital markets, and IMF. Good Samaritans, please do as wise. Affiliates of this session, the point is, do not set a minimum portion. Rather, have a flexibility plan that will help you even in repaying back the very loans that you want to keep borrowing. A government that keeps borrowing is not developing. A government that keeps borrowing is irresponsible. And we, the opposition, are saying no to that fact. Affiliates of this session, allow me to also quote the legal framework of what? The Borrowing Debt Zambia Management, which talks about from the Act of number 2018, number 1, which talks about a scope of public debt, and the article states, as I read, debt and the cost, charges and expenses incidental to management of debt, whereas this act is against the financial, bilateral and other resources, including guarantees required by borrowing by a public body in the interest of the public. Good Samaritan do as well as the interest of a public. But this government stance here seems to be forgetting that we as a public also benefit from the capital market. Hence our stance saying you cannot keep going back to the very capital market you're trying to develop and borrow more. Even the IMF has encouraged the government to actually develop their domestic investments through what? Not setting a minimum proportion. Affiliates of this session, allow me to further give the government another solution, which is the implications of issuing loans in international markets. Good Samaritan, please do as wise. Those are numbers that we are talking about. 20 seconds to conclude.
Please go ahead.
Affiliates of this session, in conclusion, let the government go back to their Zambia regulatory review that talks about a minimum coordination between the very Lusaka Stock Exchange, NAPSA, ZRA, and retail bonds so that there can be accountability, transparency, and fairness. Good Samaritans, please do as wise with these few points. May I simply say, remember, we are your home. Think of us.
Thank you so much. What a debate this is turning out to be. Ladies and gentlemen, we are down to the last two speakers of this debate. Both of them will speak for 5 minutes without interruption. We begin with the whip of the government. A round of applause for him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir, for that immaculate call. And respect to whom it is due and our diplomatic ethic be highly observed. The motion under microscopic scrutiny clearly states as articulate. This House would require a minimum proportion of government borrowing to be sourced from domestic capital market. End of quotation. It is therefore my humble obligation as a senior most government official to rebut on each and every misconception made by the opposition. through their first speaker, they earlier on alluded, talking about an aspect dealing with domestic borrowing crowds out the private sector. Members of the auditorium, allow me to make mention to say countries like South Africa, countries like the United States, and also other countries like Malaysia finance their government domestic while maintaining their vibrant private investments. One of the questions that I have to ask the opposition is that, is it excessive borrowing the real problem rather than where borrowing is coming from? Members of the auditorium, our first speaker alluded to an aspect simply dealing with reducing dependence on foreign debt. Assembled intellectuals, allow me to quote members of the auditorium from BBC, and it stated Zambian President Hichilema's 6 billion debt deal hailed as historic. Members of the auditorium, may the Good Samaritan passes to justice for further verification. I want to make mention to the opposition to say that, members of the auditorium, we have been crying as a nation, and we're not denying the fact that borrowing is one of the things that we have been depending on. But the main thing that we're talking about, dependency or 100% with regards to an aspect of us borrowing to foreign individuals, members of the auditorium, is what we are denying. And the motion has not stipulated or calculated how much percentage we need basically to borrow. But us as the government, because we believe in the people of Zambia and the muscle that we have, that indeed, members of the auditorium, what we want is to see even our domestic capital markets doing what other countries are doing, members of the auditorium. But the opposition here earlier on came to, with regards to talking about injuring our capital markets. That's not the thing, members of the auditorium. One of the other things that you have to take note, countrymen and women, is an aspect dealing with it keeps interest payment within the Zambian domain of the jurisdiction. Our speaker alluded and gave evidence with regards to this to say that, imagine, members of the auditorium, circulating our interest within our country, and we are going to make sure to say that our education sector is funded very well, our agriculture sector is funded very well, and other sectors that most of the individuals are complaining about because we are the government that cares. Members of the auditorium, allow me to quote from UNICEF, a press release that was released on October 2nd, 2025. Zambia's 2026 national budget balancing economic stability with social investment. Budget highlights indicate a balancing act between managing debt and safeguarding investment in the health sector, education sector, and social protection, critical sectors for human development. May the Good Samaritan passes to justice for fair verification. These are some of the things, members of the auditorium, that we are concentrating on as the government. We are aware, and we're not denying the fact to say that we need also to shift our leg to the foreign people in the members of the auditorium. But our many concern, for how long are we going to depend on these people, members of the auditorium? Another thing, they kept on mentioning about the budget, 2026 budget. Allow me to quote members of the auditorium to show that indeed we are a government that is aware about what is happening. And I quote, members of the auditorium, to be financed through members of the auditorium, it's stated to say that in 2026 the physical default is projected at 34.5 billion to be financed through 12.9 billion on external borrowing. We accept that. And 21.6 billion in domestic borrowing. We want our local people also to meet the standard as also these other individuals. We are a developing country, yes indeed, and that's not what we want. Our main focus is to make sure to say that Vision 2030 accumulates and acquires its stance, members of the auditorium, by not leaving anyone behind. Assembled intellectuals, my other speaker talked about an aspect dealing with exchange rates. Allow me to make mention to say to this August House that, countrymen and women, Zambia is a country basically that also runs on currency. Members of the auditorium, would you love that one day our currency basically bids with other currencies of other foreign investors? Members of the auditorium, that's what we want, and money will be circulating in the same domain or jurisdiction. But the opposition comes here to talk about an aspect of fixation with regards to what the government is doing. We are aware of everything, and that's the reason why, because we are a responsible government that listens to the people of this republic.
Go ahead.
Assembled intellectuals, our recommendation to this August House is that instead of throwing stones on one another, let us pick them and also join hands with the opposition, private sectors, foreign investors, and within the local aspect, members of the auditorium. And may I simply say, may God bless me, may God bless you, and may God bless Mother Zambia. Shalom, shalom. May the Good Samaritan bless.
Shalom. Okay, so the next debate is between Cavendish University and the University of Lusaka. So I hope both teams are in their house, because immediately after we get straight to that one. So at this point we call upon the whip of the opposition to seal the deal for this debate.
This motion is about one thing and one thing only: control. Control our debts, control our economy, control our future, and control our Zambia. Members of the House of Debate, the Bank of Zambia gives BOZ one mandate to protect financial stability. May a good Samaritan please do as wise. Resolved. Bonafide, dignified as more intellect. It would be wise to speak of my caliber to go on speaking without acknowledging the VIPs in the House of Debate. The chairperson, sir, I salute you. The judges, I bow. In simplicity, may I say, all form of protocol is highly and highly observed. Now it's our form of obligation and duty as the opposition chief whip to come forth in the House of Debate, rebut all the misconceptions that have been raised by the government. Not only that, give you a compiled summary framework of how we have moved as the opposition. Finally, give recommendations as to why we, the opposing delegation, are standing firm in conviction that yes, borrowing must continue, but what we are advocating for, what we are framing, members of the House of Debate, is that a minimum proportion should be put in place. Affiliates of the session, it is this juncture I make mention of our first point. Let me bring this home. The 2026 national budget deficit, which amounted about 34.5 billion, was locally funded. Members of the House of Debate, allow me to take this home as well. 21.6 billion was funded through the domestic capital market. Now listen as I say this. What we, the opposing delegation, are saying is that yes, borrowing should be there, but a minimum percentage or a minimum proportion shouldn't be set, because each government plan, each national development plan, each national budget comes with its own needs and wants. Therefore, if we set a minimum proportion, not only is it going to disadvantage the government, but it will also disadvantage the capital markets or the domestic capital themselves. Members of the House of Debate, with means and evidence that was extracted, members of the House of Debate, from the report of the Planning and Budgeting Committee. Members of the House of Debate, this report has clearly indicated that Zambia, yes, they've said Zambia did not borrow in 2026, but the 12.9 billion was funded by the loans that were gotten from foreign entities. Good Samaritan, please do as wise. Members of the House of Debate, now listen what we, the opposing delegation, are trying to communicate in the House of Debate. Government should diversify financing. What are we trying to talk about? Good management requires a balanced mix of borrowing. What are we trying to talk about? Yes, continue borrowing locally, continue borrowing from the domestic capital market, but given an opportunity to borrow from national entities, the government of Zambia, it has liberty to borrow from them. Anyways, this is even the message that the Securities and Exchange Commission is trying to preach under the capital market master plan. Members of the House of Intellectuals, on the objectives and the vision, they've clearly outlined what they seek to integrate. Good Samaritan, please do as wise. Not only that, members of the House of Intellect, our speaker clearly outlines to say when we set the minimum standard, not only is it going to be a disadvantage to the governments themselves, but also to the capital market. Now let me be a practical speaker. The 8th National Development Plan was developed. Now we are developing the 9th National Development Plan. A question I'll ask the government is the needs or the ones that were in the 8th National Development Plan the same as the needs in the 9th National Development Plan? Because of the fluctuation in needs, that's why we, the opposing delegation, are saying yes, let's borrow to integrate this economy, to support the domestic capital market, to grow and provide opportunity that the government have been talking about. But our stance is that we shouldn't set a minimum proportion. Affiliates of the session, because this will hinder flexibility, as my speakers have earlier mentioned. Now, members of the debate, thirdly, the capital market is too small and the capital market is still growing, but But the government of this house, as they even said they're going to pay the same arrears that they've been having, which has amounted to about 80.2 billion. The question that they asked is, how long are we going to do this as a country? My question to them is, when are you going to pay back the debt you are owing the people? Good Samaritan, do as wise. Members of the House of Debate. Now, the first speaker came from proposing delegation, said when we borrow from the local domestic capital markets, it's going to reduce national dependence on foreign trade. Panel of adjudicators, let me be slow as I speak this. We, the opposing delegation, are not saying we shouldn't borrow. We are happy that the government is borrowing from the domestic capital markets. We are happy with the investment projections they are making, but our stance is that because they're already owing, because they're already trying to develop this country, they shouldn't just set a minimum proportion. Let them borrow without setting a minimum proportion. Finally, members of the House of Debate, to give you a compiled summary framework, our first speaker came in the House of Debate, defining the key terminologies, the motion. 30 seconds to wind up. By making the motion user-friendly, also highlighted the fact that yes, we recognize borrowing should be there, but without a minimum proportion. Finally, to give you a recommendation that the government need to prioritize in order to ensure that yes, borrowing continue without a minimum proportion. Government should deepen the capital market infrastructure, increase resettlement systems by paying your debt. Don't claim you're going to pay your debts and give time to this capital market to develop. With these few but yet convincing points, I raise my case.
Ladies and gentlemen, the second quarter-final has come to an end. Let's give a round of applause to both teams. This particular debate is quite a big one because it involves the reigning champions. Like I said, they've represented the province 3 times in a row. So it will be a change if they don't this year. We'll get to find out soon enough whether they continue with their march to represent the province and defend their title, or their journey ends here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll allow both teams to shake hands as they leave the stage. So I'll ask that the placards be changed. The next teams are Cavendish University and the University of Lusaka. For the next debate, Cavendish University is the government. The University of Lusaka are the opposition. As we wait for them to come up front, we'll use that time to allow the judges to compile the results of the just ended debate. All right, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's please welcome Cavendish University to the front. And now let's welcome the University of Lusaka. Okay, so I am told that. Are we okay? Okay. I'm told that, or I hear that this is the battle of private institutions. Or private companies. Okay. I hear the previous one was the battle of neighbors. Okay. They're also neighbors. Oh, okay. Seems we are having a lot of residential disputes, eh? Okay, so in this debate, Cavendish University is the government and the University of Lusaka are the opposition. Okay, so the motion states as follows. This House would prefer long-term infrastructure financing through domestic government bonds rather than concessional external loans. Just to be clear, that's the motion we've both prepared for, yes? Okay, great. This House would prefer long-term infrastructure through financing. Sorry, let me say that again. This House would prefer long-term infrastructure financing through domestic government bonds rather than concessional external loans. Ladies and gentlemen, to begin this third quarterfinal, let's please welcome the Prime Minister.
Maybe you can try first before my time begins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that call. All protocol is highly observed. Now, today the motion states, as I quote, this House would prefer long-term infrastructure financing through domestic government bonds rather than concessional external loans. Ladies and gentlemen, every country wants long-term infrastructure, but the question is, who should finance it? Should Zambia build its future using money borrowed from foreigners, or should Zambia invest in itself through domestic funds? Today, we are not debating infrastructure. Today, we are debating ownership. And as the proposition, we choose ownership. The motion compares two ways of financing infrastructure. The first is through domestic government bonds, where the government borrows from its own citizens and institutions. And the second is through concessional external loans, where the government borrows from foreign governments at lower interest rates. We do agree. But both can build long-term infrastructure, but the difference is who benefits in the long run. Ladies and gentlemen, our motion is simple. A nation should trust its own economy before depending on others. Now, when the government issues domestic bonds, it is not expecting every Zambian citizen to finance it. However, these bonds are bought by the commercial banks and insurance companies and investors. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the government then repays these institutions with interest over time. Now, why exactly is this important? You may wonder. Because the interest paid on these bonds stay within Zambia, and it strengthens our financial institutions, and it strengthens our capital markets. The main reason we are here today, ladies and gentlemen. Not only that, instead of wealth going out of our country, it continues circulating within our country. Now, I know what the opposition will bring in. They will talk about the crowding effect. I mean, why shouldn't they? But before they do, let me enlighten you what the crowding effect is. The crowding effect is simply when banks buy the government loans. Why? When banks buy the government loans instead of lending to the businesses. But ladies and gentlemen, this argument is based on assumptions, and an argument based on assumption is an argument that cannot suffice. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are not educating for is irresponsible domestic borrowing or excessive domestic borrowing. What we are saying, that the motion is saying we prefer domestic borrowing. It is not saying that we only want domestic borrowing. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, banks are not the only buyers of government bonds. Instead, insurance companies and other institutional investors also invest in them. So a balanced domestic market, it can finance infrastructure while the private sector continues to access capital. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the opposition will also say that concessional loans are with low interest. And yes, we do agree. But the cheapest option today is not the best option tomorrow. I have evidence with me that says in 2020, Zambia failed to repay a 42.5 million in debt. And if the interest rates were so low, then why exactly did Zambia fail to pay that? Have you ever thought about it? Aloud.
If I can recall, that debt was not from a concessional loan. It was from a normal external loan. A concessional loan has no commercial perk attached to it. So could you please elaborate further?
Thank you very much for that point, and I would love your evidence to show that that was a normal loan. Allow me to proceed. Experts say a prolonged debt crisis could permanently prevent countries like Zambia from recovering, leading to what? Poverty and joblessness.
Your time is up.
20 seconds to conclude.
20 seconds it is.
Mr. Speaker, a country does not financially become independent if it continuously borrows outside for solutions. It becomes independent by believing in its own economy. Thank you.
What a submission, ladies and gentlemen. The Prime Minister, a round of applause. Well, let's hear what their private neighbors have to say. Ladies and gentlemen, the leader of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, the timekeepers, and esteemed guests. Pride does not pave highways. Egos do not build schools. And the romanticized desire for financial autarky does not electrify rural municipalities. The proposition's vision on relying entirely on domestic capital ignores a harsh and undeniable reality. Developing nations simply do not possess the domestic liquidity required to finance their own modernization. I, Atupele Piri, believes that standing on the motion, this opposing the motion that this House would prefer long-term infrastructure financing through domestic government bonds rather than concessional external laws. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to recalibrate this debate with economic pragmatism. Concessional external laws are debts given at a non-commercial terms. These terms are favorable to the borrower and not the lender. I'd like to also note that the World Bank classifies these as indispensable development lifelines. Lady or rejected. Indispensable, honorable judges. I'll give a quick definition. Mandatory. These are synonyms. Mandatory, crucial, vital, necessary, required, absolutely necessary. This is a definition by the World Bank. Necessary for developmental lifelines. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall ask the Good Samaritan to hand the following over. Honorable judges, domestic government bonds in the context of developing economies. The IMF notes that the domestic capital pools are exceptionally shallow. Consequently, governments must issue short tenor debt at punishable exorbitant risk premiums to attract buyers. As I redefine, ladies and gentlemen, rejected this motion from an archaic battle over geopolitical posturing into a rigorous calculus of intergenerational equity and wealth distribution. And we can clearly see that this choice is between sharing the cost of national development, ladies and gentlemen, across multiple generations versus placing a crushing and immediate burden on today's working class while simultaneously starving local innovators and vital. Accepted.
Members of this august house, the Honorable Speaker mentioned about the IMF, which Zambia is a party to. The IMF's extended debt facility for Zambia requires continued fiscal discipline. Therefore, it means it has commitments. If the government must align its fiscal commitments with this program from the IMF to access financing, how then does Zambia retain economic policy flexibility, especially considering that IMF has commitments, and for you to borrow from IMF under conventional loans, you have to have commitments. Let us get the facts right.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to note that as my second speaker will submit the evidence that the Zambia is part of the IMF, and concessional means the terms are favorable. We set the terms, ladies and gentlemen, and these terms are made for development. I'd like to, as I continue with my argument, I'd like to state that the proposition willingly ignores the plutocratic reality of domestic debt. Because local money is scarce, ladies and gentlemen, the state must offer colossal double-digit interest rates. And who will purchase these bonds? The domestic elite? The oligopolistic banks? The government effectively taxes the impoverished working class to pay risk-free profits to the wealthiest tier of society, which buy these government bonds. Furthermore, this absorbs all available capital, completely crowding out rejected everyday entrepreneurs, as she failed to explain. The individual trying to launch a renewable energy startup or a logistical business is simply left out because there is no money for this. I'll submit a case study of the Kariba Dam, ladies and gentlemen. In 2014, 25 million United States dollars was awarded to Zambia. This is our lifeline. The Kariba Dam is our lifeline. It powers our everyday life. I'll ask the Good Samaritan to end this over.
May the speaker pause? Interjection allowed.
So, Honorable Member, are you suggesting that Zambia should continue relying on external financial indefinitely? Yes or no?
I'll kindly ask the Prime Minister to wait for my conclusion, and I'll answer indefinitely. Ladies and gentlemen, as I was mentioning about the Kariba Dam, Zambia relies mainly, Zambia's main energy source relies on the Kariba Dam.
Your time is up. 20 seconds it is.
As I conclude, we cannot construct the metropolis of tomorrow by bleeding the hard-working citizens of tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, for the sake of pragmatic, rapid, and sustainable progress, we must decisively reject this motion. And I emphatically beg to propose, as I say, cheaper debt is better than costly debt. Thank you.
The leader of the opposition laying the foundation on behalf of the government, on behalf of the opposition. I will ask that you move because of that device that you have. I don't understand. The laptop itself? No, you cannot submit the device. Unless you're using the device itself, but if it's information on the device, it cannot be used. Yes. All right, so we continue with the debate. Ladies and gentlemen, the Deputy Prime Minister will be taking the floor now.
One, two. 1, 2. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your call. May I firstly say, all protocol be highly observed. You see, the government is simply proposing to the motion. This House would prefer long-term infrastructure financing through domestic bonds rather than concessional external loans. Why do we want this? You see, domestic bonds do one thing, and one thing very well. They eliminate currency exchange risk, and they help stabilize our economy. You see, Zambia in 2020 defaulted on its loans, and the IMF said that this was due to 50% of our economy's value, us losing 50% of our economy's value. This simply meant that debt servicing became excruciating and we could not handle it. Now you see, if we continue to rely on these loans that we could not pay, these loans that have shown us that we cannot if we continue to rely on these loans that are not sustainable, you see, these loans that we could not pay back, how will we advance? You see, domestic bonds are issued in kwacha, they are borrowed in kwacha, and they are paid back in kwacha, eliminating currency risk. Don't the Zambian people deserve that? Don't they? Allowed?
Honorable judges, the World Bank classifies these consensual external loans as extended maturation of up to 40 years with negligible interest rates. So when you say they are not sustainable, I don't know what you're trying to say, because it clearly states that they last up to 40 years with negligible interest rates. Where is the sustainability?
You see, what is not being taken into account is the exchange rate. When the currency lost 50% of its value, that meant that a loan that was taken of 100 million kwacha cost 150 million kwacha in 5 years. 5 years. If now take that over 40 years, 100 million kwacha, 150, 150, 300, 300, eventually 1 billion. Is that sustainable? I think not. Moving on. You see, domestic bonds, they deepen our capital markets. Isn't that what we are trying to achieve? According to the Ministry of Finance's own benchmark bond policy, they state that domestic bonds help deepen our domestic market because they are great investment vehicles for long-term investment, and they create better investment platforms for the Zambian people. Again, money issued in kwacha, borrowed in kwacha, paid back in kwacha. The money circulates within the nation. How will we achieve these policy objectives if every time we need money, we run to the World Bank, IDA, or China? The people deserve financial independence. You see, one thing they won't tell you about concessional loans are the conditions that come with them. According to our very own government, over $6 billion was committed to us by the Chinese government. But those loans came with implicit and explicit conditions that we had to use Chinese constructors and Chinese equipment. Now imagine we get the loan, we buy their equipment, so the money goes back to them. We pay back the loan and with interest. Is that fair to the Zambian people? I think not. You see, to conclude, I put it simply. The Zambian people deserve better. Don't they deserve an economy that is built by them, that is led by them, that lives and breathes for them? With this view, but convincing points, I drop bars.
What a quarterfinal this is turning out to be. Ladies and gentlemen, the Deputy Prime Minister. But we still have quite a few more speakers to speak before it can be decided. At this point, the Deputy Opposition Leader takes the floor.
Esteemed judges, fellow debaters, the floor at large, with the interest of time, allow me to just say all protocols be highly observed. The government says that we defaulted on a loan, but it was not a concessional loan as seen here. We said that it says here that Zambia failed to make coupon payments on a dollar bond, not a concessional loan. By the way, a concessional loan does not have coupon payments attached to it. It has low interest rates, sometimes even of 0%. May the Good Samaritan please pass this evidence to the judge. I continue with my first point. Concessional external loans are cheaper and more fiscally sustainable than domestic bonds. What's the point of obtaining domestic debt if we cannot even afford to sustain it with the high interest rates that are put or attached to it? Right here I have before you is a case study that was carried out in Rwanda that shows the massive development that came with a low interest concessional loan. Rejected. Ladies and gentlemen, domestic government bonds in many African countries carry higher interest rates due to inflation and higher domestic borrowing costs. Financing infrastructure domestically can therefore increase debt service costs and fiscal space. By the way, Zambia does not have enough money to finance any form of high-tech infrastructure that it is lobbying for. I have a theory that supports my point. Allowed?
Mr. Speaker, do you concede to the fact that your opposition leader said concessional external loans do not have policy attached to it? Yes or no?
What do you mean by policy? I guess they meant low interest rates. We set the terms, not them. How is the debt sustainability framework framed? The debt sustainability framework argues that countries choose financing that minimizes borrowing costs while keeping debt at sustainable levels. It's economics. You have to be rational as a government. My second point is heavy domestic borrowing. Heavy domestic borrowing crowds out private investment and slows down economic growth. They defined it, but I will explain it in detail. Crowding out in detail basically just means that, let's say for example, they're the government and they're getting your bonds. What money will you have to invest? Nothing. But there'll be very high interest rates, making borrowing higher on your end as the citizens of this country. May the Good Samaritan please pass evidence to the judges. As an evidence bearer and the evidence warrior of this motion, I also have a Bank of Zambia statement that talks about the downtrend that the sovereign bank nexus raises risk of contagion as the sovereign's failure to meet its obligations. This could lead to liquidity shortages, material losses, and insolvency for local businesses. The people of the country are going to be the ones suffering, crying at the government's door tomorrow, saying, we don't have money, we can't access loans, how are we going to finance and sustain everyday running of our businesses? In conclusion,
Mr. Speaker, if concessional loans can be considered to be external lending, then if these external lenders require debt sustainability assessments before approving financing, who ultimately then decides for these Zambians on how infrastructure is going to be built? Is it then the government of Zambia which wants to borrow from the people, or it's the lender who is a foreign entity and there's nothing to do besides interest and profits? Thank you.
The IMF is not a profit-based organization. It helps developing nations such as Zambia, and I expected the government to raise that. But this is the government that the people have today. My last point, ladies and gentlemen, is that as the opposition, we promise as the opposition to acquire cheaper debt that is going to give you, the Zambians, a better future with high technology and higher sustainability in order to ensure that in order to ensure that our economy is able to compete in the top 3 in the SADC region, and of course in the African region. With these few points, I'd like to rest my case. Thank you.
This is what debate should be. Fire after fire. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Cavendish University versus the University of Lusaka. The private neighbors. Let's hear what the government member has to say in response.
Ladies and gentlemen, all protocol is highly observed. A nation that cannot finance its own future does not own its future. And that is why, as government, we are standing on the fact that we want a Zambian built economy. A Zambia built by Zambians. Firstly, getting to my point, ladies and gentlemen, opposition is not getting the fact that this is not a debate about refusing concessional external loans. This is about preference. Preference means first choice, not only choice. And opposition is not getting that, ladies and gentlemen. Bringing me to my first point, which is financial sovereignty leads to economic sovereignty. Means freedom not just politically but economically. The IMF that the opposition keeps mentioning, let me just tell you something. In the conditionality on sovereign debt document that they released, said that their first sentence is even the fact that by offering loans in exchange for policy reforms that they are saying do not exist. Opposition, do you understand what you are putting Zambia in? Because we don't think so. Coming to the point that this is not free money, ladies and gentlemen. Who gives out free money nowadays? As they are saying that Zambia was awarded free money, ladies and gentlemen. That's not what it stands. Remember that a hand that feeds you decides what's on the menu. So what's on the menu coming from these concessional external loans? Ladies and gentlemen, let's let Zambia grow. It's done crawling, and opposition is not getting that, and that is so sad, ladies and gentlemen. They keep saying that Zambia cannot do it. Allow it to stand so it can fall, because it can only fall if it stands. So why not give it the opportunity to stand? And that is what we are saying as government. Coming to the point, ladies and gentlemen, that there are so many institutions that are willing to help Zambia grow. So many institutions that are willing to help with these domestic government bonds that we are talking about. Just recently, NAPSA literally gave the money for us to build the Lusaka Dollar Road. Is that not a domestic government bond? It is, ladies and gentlemen. We gave it an opportunity and it grew. And this is not, ladies and gentlemen, just about economics, about readiness of accumulating money. No, this is about sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen. This is about having the independence to be able to decide what we use our money for, when we use it, how we use it. But ladies and gentlemen, these concessional external loans tell us how to do that. Is Zambia really ours? I don't think so. Coming to the point of intergenerational wealth, not intergenerational debt. We want Zambia to grow, and opposition is not getting that. We want a Zambia that is not, and even the evidence that I have here, ladies and gentlemen, it talks about in 2020, Zambia fell on a default because of a debt, ladies and gentlemen. That means they had to borrow from the IMF that they are still talking about again. Imagine paying Maria's debt with Peter's debt with Paul's debt. Until when, ladies and gentlemen? Until when? We want an intergenerational what? Wealthy country, ladies and gentlemen. And opposition is so sad to see the fact that they keep telling us that Zambia is not ready. Zambia is not ready? NAPSA showed you that we are ready, and we are ready to take over the world, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready to take over the fact that our economy is ready to grow. So opposition, give it a chance. And these conditions that they are talking about, ladies and gentlemen, it's fiscal conditions. Go ahead.
Madam Speaker, you keep on talking about the debt. Please supply us with evidence that shows that that was a concessional loan and not just any other loan. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's what opposition keeps talking about proof that it's a concessional external loan, not just a loan. They keep talking about the bill bond, ladies and gentlemen. This is a conversation about IMF. IMF, it's a concessional external loan lender. And that's what the evidence we keep giving. And this evidence is right here, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about the conditions that it come with. And thank you. That is all we have to say, esteemed government.
What a submission, ladies and gentlemen, the member of government. This is a good debate. Let's hear what the member of opposition has to say. I can see he's eagerly waiting to speak. A round of applause for him as he comes forward.
Respect to the honorable judges of the entire House. My name is Botafat. As I restate the motion, the House would prefer long-term infrastructure financing through domestic government bonds rather than concessional external loans. Members of the House, allow me to start by this. How do you finance something when you do not have the capacity to do so? My first point to stand on my ground is that concessional borrowing supports development agendas. Members of the House, as the government already stated that Zambia is indeed a developing nation. And for Zambia, if we look at it, there was a time that it wanted macroeconomic stability. And for that, it went on and had an agreement with the IMF to actually get what is known as the IMF concessional external loan. Why? So that Zambia can now be stable. Members of the House, this is clearly an indication. If we look at the 2026 budget, hello.
Considering that Zambia itself has introduced the dollarization policy that states that all companies and entities in Zambia should be dealing with kwacha, why don't you think that it is essential for us to move all public long-term infrastructure financing to the kwacha?
I think I earlier stated to say you cannot build something when you do not have the materials. Members of the House, as I continue, if we look at the 2026 budget that was addressed by the Honorable Dr. Situmbeko Msokotwane, my good sir, please. Judges, come with me. If we look at page 9, paragraph 58, it clearly states that indeed about 1,500 megawatts of solar was now supposed to come online within 12 months, and also 300 megawatts. If we look at the Mamba thermal point, that is actually what we are talking about. Zambia is now bringing in things that will actually stabilize our economy. And also, if we look at the earlier stated point, which I mentioned to say, Zambia had a target. And if we look at the budget itself, okay, if we go to page 25, my good sir. If we look at page 25 of paragraph 150, it clearly shows that 12.9 billion on external borrowing for 2026, or which is rather 1.4% of the GDP, broken into 3.83 billion program loans and also 9.4 billion kwacha, of which is for the project. And we see that indeed Zambia is not just getting money for useless purposes, but these are for the projects that will not only benefit the government but the people of the country. And it is so unwise that the government is not understanding this point.
Honorable member, if international institutions themselves encourage countries to strengthen domestic resource mobilization and domestic capital markets, why should Zambia not prefer domestic government bonds whenever it is feasible to do so? Please explain.
I think my earlier speaker stated to say domestic bonds carry huge interest rates. Members of the House, allow me to proceed. Judges, come with me. If we look at
page 27 of the same document, paragraph 152 to 153, it also states to say domestic servicing for 2026 is about 52 billion kwacha, while the external debt is at 21.7 billion kwacha for external debt. And the minister himself explained to say this is because the treasury bills and the bonds are now being paid at the same time, and we can see the huge figure, members of the House. Government, this drives 30 seconds to sum up.
20 seconds only.
My second point is that external loans supply the foreign currency Zambia's infrastructure actually needs, because our currency is kwacha denominated, and we know that the universal currency is what? Is the dollar. Members of the House, as I conclude, I say that a cheaper cost is better than a huge cost. I submit.
One thing I like about competition is as it goes further, it gets better, yeah? A round of applause for the member of opposition. In case you're joining us online, this is the third quarterfinal between Cavendish University and the University of Lusaka. And no, it's not the final. It's just a quarterfinal. Ladies and gentlemen, to seal the deal on behalf of the government, let's please welcome the whip of the government. He will speak for 5 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen of this august house, all protocol is observed. Now, we as the government have been arguing on one thing and one thing only, that Zambia must be built by Zambian wealth and Zambia must be built by Zambians. And that is why we are saying that long-term infrastructure financing in Zambia should be done through government bonds rather than using external concessional loans. Now, in my argument, I will be placing a final summary on the opposition's argument, and mainly speaking to interest rates and how concessional loans have no policy agreements. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand one thing and one thing only. Whenever you borrow money, there are terms and conditions that are going to be applied to it. That is the same way concessional loans work. They do not just accompany interest rates, they also accompany policy agreements. And we do concede to the fact that some of these policy agreements may be for the betterment of our nation, but majority of the time, the profits, the use of that money, the use of constructors, and the use of buildings will be directed within that same concessional agreement for us to acquire that money. Now, secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that interest rates might be friendly right now, but are they friendly to the future generation? And is that morally just for us to give off debt, to get debt today for those born 40 years from today to pay it later? That is not a fair answer, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we must also understand when it comes to interest rates, remember, when you are taxed in kwacha, you pay in kwacha. You buy in kwacha and you build in kwacha. The answer is wherever you're going to go, whenever you're going to pay, or whenever you're required to pay, the answer is always going to be kwacha, whether it's 2018 or whether it's 2050. Now, that's the difference with external concessional loans. Because of these factors such as inflation, depreciation, our kwacha, once it goes on an external loan, 1 million today can be 1 million USD can be 18 million kwacha today, but tomorrow the kwacha can appreciate to mean 1 million is 13 million, or it can depreciate to 1 million is equal to 50 million. Now, that is the danger of these external loans. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us proceed to how us as the government have been showing this argument. We've discussed about it socially as how the use of government bonds contributes directly to national development, because we're including citizens, as citizens are going to be using kwacha, paying in kwacha, getting their amounts in kwacha, investments in kwacha, profits in kwacha. Even the government itself will be using what? Kwacha. Now let us go also politically, this government itself has created significant policies. Number one being the dollarization policy, which eliminates the use of foreign currency within Zambia itself. And then secondly, it is the triple P consideration that it has when it comes to gaining external loans. That is a 70% to 30% ratio, which means our motion that states that we prefer bonds should stand because we as the government are preferring kwacha. Now, economically, we are saying that we are creating economic sovereignty because these concessional external loans come with one thing to the government, and that is policy considerations. Whether they are good or bad, no one wants a Chinese to govern Zambia. No one wants Xi Jinping to come and tell Hichilema how to do his job. And that is exactly what we are trying to do when we are avoiding conventional loans by using governmental bonds. And then, morally, ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you this. If your father owed someone in 1980, trust me, you do not want to pay that debt. And that is the same thing we should be doing for the next generation of Zambians who are to come in this. Ladies and gentlemen, the use of government bonds only enhances our capital markets. It limits our currency risk. And therefore, we're creating a better economy, not just for the youth who want to invest, for us, the youth who are there today, but for the youth who are there tomorrow, and for the children who come after. That when they come, the kwacha will be there, the kwacha will not go, and the kwacha will stay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that in conclusion, as the government, the word prefer is our primary argument. And that is why we are saying that just like we have upkept this economy and we are going with this new Dawn government, let us take the consideration of kwacha, which are bonds, before we use external loans, as these are the future of Zambia. Now, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let us tell you how we are going to recommend the issuance of bonds. Number one, we need specific tailored bonds, such as the case of Zimbabwe, where we introduce transport bonds, term bonds, railway bonds, the likes. Secondly, we need NAPSA to be the anchoring. Same thing that it did on the Kitwe-Ndola Road is the same thing that we would require. Institutions such as NAPSA should be the primary anchoring positions for the government. Then thirdly, we need to 20 seconds to summarize.
20 seconds it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, just besides these governmental institutions that are there, we have commercial banks in Zambia run by Zambians, and we have these banks alongside other institutions working in kwacha. Remember, Zambia must be built by Zambian wealth and by Zambians, and it's kwacha to kwacha to kwacha, and we shall receive kwacha.
Are you sure you people are intellectuals? Sec, please give this man a bonus in kwacha. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the government has sealed the deal. They are done. And now all they can do is wait and listen. Let's give an opportunity to the whip of the opposition.
To the highly esteemed judges, to the Speaker, to the honorable members of the government, to the members of the House, my salutations of the day. If you allow me to reside on the already established protocol. We have gathered here today to debate whether Zambia should finance infrastructure through domestic bonds or concessional loans. Now, I want to say that this is not an issue of preference, because if it was an issue of preference, why are we even sitting in this debate today? Why are we having this debate? We are wasting our time. We are here to debate what works. The proposition spoke about sovereignty and control. They painted a beautiful, beautiful picture of domestic borrowing as the patriotic choice. But honorable judges, I want us to look at the real numbers. I want you to look at the real numbers that affect real Zambian lives. We're not talking about small money here. We're talking about money that can change millions and millions of livelihoods on a day-to-day basis. Let us look at the numbers. The 2026 budget spends 253.1 billion kwacha. Domestic revenues contribute 206.5 billion kwacha, and the government plans to borrow 34.5 billion kwacha, 21.6 billion from the inside of Zambia, and 12.9 billion from outside. May the Good Samaritan do as is wise. Here is where the problem lies. The debt service is the single largest item on the budget, 73.6 billion kwacha. Of that, 52 billion kwacha goes to domestic debt servicing. That is 21% total expenditure and 29% of all domestic revenues. Let me repeat that for you. Nearly 1/3 of every Zambian kwacha collected in taxes goes straight to paying these domestic creditors. The proposition says domestic bonds keep money in Zambia. But I want you to ask, and it sounds patriotic, but I want you to ask one uncomfortable question. Who gets that 52 billion kwacha? Not the woman who's selling at the kiosk, or as we call it in Zambia, the kantemba. Not the not the farmer that you left back in the village. I'll answer that question for you. Who gets that 52 billion kwacha? Wealthy Zambians, pension funds, insurance companies, banks, corporations. It's the poor Zambian that is it is the poor Zambian taxpayer that is paying the wealthy Zambian bondholder. That is not patriotism. That is regressive redistribution. Wealth is flowing upward. Concessional external loans offer lower interest rates, longer maturities, and the fiscal breathing space we so badly need as a country. Members of the House, the opposition also adequately demonstrated that we cannot afford domestic borrowing. It comes at such a huge cost. Inflation, people, crowding out of private investors, as the Prime Minister of the government had so beautifully defined for us. The government says a loan paid in a different currency isn't sustainable. But I want to ask, how sustainable is a loan that has got a punishing interest of 50 to 20%? It's so expensive to pay. The simple principle is, cheaper money means more money for development. When we pay 18% on domestic debt, every 100 kwacha we borrow costs 18 kwacha per year in interest. When we borrow concessionally, 1 to 2% interest. Every 100 kwacha just costs 1 to 200 kwacha. That difference per 100 kwacha could go to hospitals, schools, and roads. Domestic borrowing hurts businesses and jobs. When the government borrows heavily from local banks, there's less money left for businesses due to crowding out, as was defined beautifully by the Prime Minister. What does crowding out mean? It means small businesses cannot get loans. It means SMEs cannot get loans. It means jobs are not created. The simple principle is that when the government takes all the credit, businesses get none. Concessional external loans bring new money into Zambia rather than recycling existing savings. They don't crowd out the private sector, they add to it. To the Speaker of the House, domestic debt is a trap, just a different kind. The government asked this House to choose symbolism, which is beautiful, but the opposition asked the House to choose sustainability. Sustainability for you, for me, for Zambia. That is true patriotism. We urge this House to reject the motion. We say cheaper debt is better than costly debt. We proudly beg to oppose. Thank you.
A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. This was a good debate. Congratulations to both teams. I will allow you to shake hands as you leave the stage. Let's be together, please. You know, I'd like to consider myself a strict moderator, but sometimes even I am rendered speechless. Okay, so we are left with one more quarterfinal, and this one is between the Lusaka Business and Technical College and Levi Mwanawasa Medical University. So I'll allow for the change of placards before the debaters can be called up front. During this time, the judges will also be deliberating on the points. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the last quarterfinal and the last debate of the day. Let's start by welcoming Lusaka Business and Technical